Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
In 2020, as COVID took hold and 1/3 of the planet's population went into lockdown, some cities across the world rapidly rolled out provision for active travel, reallocating road space to allow for people to walk and cycle, helping, for instance, key workers get safely to hospitals, and so on. But these changes sometimes incurred strong emotions from the public and became politically charged. To explore the politics of active travel, I'm delighted to be joined by the former Labour leader of Ealing Council for 11 years and board member of Transport for London. Welcome, Councillor Julian Bell. Thanks for joining today's CIHT podcast. I'm your host, Justin Ward. So your journey to active travel is somewhat one of a personal one, starting about 9 years ago following a consultation with your doctor. Can you tell me what happened?
Yeah, so great to be here. And essentially I sat in front of my GP and she said, she didn't say it in these brutal terms, but it came across to me. It was you're for the knackers yard, son. And my blood pressure was high, my cholesterol was high, I was overweight, bordering on obese, and she wanted to prescribe statins. And I said, well, what about a lifestyle change? And she said, well, that would be great, but you're probably too busy. And I said, maybe, but give me a chance. And essentially she kind of said, well, I'm going to give you the prescription for the statins in any case, but see how you get on. So I pondered over this for a few days. My car had just broken down and gone to the scrapyard in the Sky. And so I made a conscious decision not to buy another car. And because I'd been trying to cycle, and every time I was late and every time it rained, I'd hop in the car. And so I thought, if I get rid of the car, then definitely I can really make a lifestyle change and cycle everywhere I go. So that's what I did. And I actually, and I have told my GP this, I never went and got those statins. That I think somewhere I still have that prescription as a little battle honour. And I started to cycle. It was really, really tough for me at first. 2 miles to the town hall was as if I'd done a stage of the Tour de France. I was absolutely cream crackered, and but I stuck at it, and I slowly began to cycle more and more, to the point where I started to go into inner London as well, and that was a major hurdle to cycle into central London and back out again. But no, I also kind of made a public pledge. It was in 2012, and I'd been to see some school children. Each school had designated an Olympic champion, and they were looking at the Olympic values, and they had to make some physical commitments around one of the values. And as I closed this conference of school Olympic champions, and we were running up to 2012 Olympics, I thought, well, let me make a pledge here and say what I'm going to do. And I pledged that in 2012 I was going to cycle 2012 miles. And immediately I said it, I thought, oh, you should have said kilometers, because that would have, it seemed as if I'd bitten off more than I could chew. But I'd made that, I deliberately made the commitment public in order to, again, try and make myself do it. And 6 months later, I'd done the 2012. I used to ride this old mountain bike that I'd bought secondhand for £65, I think it was. And it was like pedaling a truck. It was just, it was incredibly tough. But one of my colleagues at the council, one of the officers who was a keen cyclist, he'd persuaded me that if I actually could stick at this and cycle using the mountain bike, in his phrase, I would be as fit as a butcher's dog, and I should reward myself through the cycle to work scheme with a nice road bike when I met my 2012 target, which of course I did, and I got my road bike, and then I kind of was a serious cyclist after that point. But it was a fabulous experience, because after those 6 months, I went back to the GP, and it was normal weight, normal blood pressure, normal cholesterol, and my GP was in wonderment. How did you do it? And I said,
miracle pill, isn't it? Exercise there on that one.
Yeah. So how did you do it? I said, well, nothing really. I just bought a bike, and I've ridden a bike, and I haven't done much else. And this is the outcome. And I remember leaving her office with her voice ringing in my ears. I'll have to get a bike. And it was a real kind of active travel epiphany, that whole experience for me. It was really powerful.
It's interesting we've just come off the back of COP, haven't we? And there was a lot of noise about electric vehicles, but possibly not as much about behaviour change, although the committee that holds the government to account, the CCC, has looked at how we decarbonise transport, and behaviour change is a big component. How optimistic are you that other people can kind of undertake a similar journey, I guess, from maybe a car-based life to an active travel-based life? Are you kind of optimistic that we'll see a shift that is needed?
Yeah, I'm always optimistic. I'm always hopeful. I'm a Sheffield United fan, so I have to be of an optimistic nature. I was disappointed that COP didn't talk more about active travel and cycling and walking. I think there is too much emphasis on just transitioning from fossil fuel powered vehicles to EVs, and they don't solve all of the problems at all. You still get all the brake wear and tyre wear throwing up PM 2.5, small particles into the air, which are the worst kind for impacting on human health, getting into the bloodstream and causing all kinds of really terrible problems for the human body. So and of course doesn't do anything in terms of congestion either, and of course they are still kind of metal boxes that will kill people if you drive them in a bad way. So I'm if people can have that experience that I had, and we'll give it a try, and you hope that as these messages about the kind of future of the planet and the existential crisis that we've got with climate change, that will be the nudge to make people make the effort. And then once you get on your bike and you're in the fresh air and you see more things, you hear more things, it uplifts you, your mental health improves. It's a fabulous experience, and if people can get that experience, and again, it's about overcoming the fear of sharing the road with these hunks of metal that are screaming, roaring past you, that I think is the other big challenge. So it's putting in that safe cycling infrastructure that will get people over that hurdle of fear of accidents and safety. I was very much driven by stats. I've always been a kind of I guess I say to people, if you're a politician, by definition you're a risk taker, and you kind of do the numbers in terms of whether you can win a vote or not. And I kind of did the numbers on cycling, and I'd say to people, look, I can cycle in London for kind of 950 years before I have a serious or fatal accident. That's the odds, and that's if I cycled literally every day. I think 5 days. If you cycled 5 days a week for 950 years, it would take that time for you statistically. But of course, it's not necessarily rational. People are frightened of getting on their bike.
So I know you've quoted Lyndon B. Johnson's famous quote about the first rule of politics was that practitioners need to be able to count. And I'm thinking about this in relation to active travel, but particularly the kind of politics of low traffic neighbourhoods. How relevant was that when these were rolled out? And perhaps say a little bit about what we mean by low traffic neighbourhoods first, but then the relevance of that quote to low traffic neighbourhoods.
Yeah, so low traffic neighbourhoods were rolled out in the immediate aftermath of that, as that first lockdown of COVID was ending, and it was to avoid a kind of car-led recovery. There was clearly the fear of going on public transport and catching COVID because you weren't able to social distance was what drove this. And so, suddenly from having had councils having had very little funding for cycling and walking and active travel schemes, we were suddenly offered money to put in temporary cycle lanes, to put in low traffic neighbourhoods. And low traffic neighbourhoods have been something that's been done for decades, both in the UK and wider, where essentially you take a discrete local area with some major border roads, but it's essentially an area of residential streets that increasingly with these wayfinding apps, people were now driving through them to find quick ways to get from wherever they were going to wherever they needed to be. And so low traffic neighbourhoods would essentially stop some of that through traffic driven by these wayfinding apps and make it a quieter, safer residential street. Low traffic neighbourhoods, the data's shown, actually can reduce traffic accidents by 50%. And so essentially you would block off certain roads and it was done with planters, with bollards, and you would still be able to get access to every home within that low traffic neighbourhood area, but maybe you would have to have a bigger journey, a longer journey, or a different journey in order to get to your front door. But essentially it cut the traffic and made it much safer to walk and cycle, and especially for young children as well. They were able to feel much safer with that reduction in traffic. And what it did do, though, was cause a really kind of big controversy. And certainly the reaction was strong, and there was a very vocal and active, and certainly in Ealing, reaction to putting low traffic neighbourhoods in. And I've talked about how politicians really need to learn how to lean into a stiff wind on these kind of things. And it's my experience that whenever you take away or curtail or change the way that someone can drive their car or park their car, you will have a reaction. And politicians have got to gauge whether or not all of the benefits that have been outlined for low traffic neighbours are in fact happening when they implement them. And also, they're politicians. They have to think about counting the numbers and what's the electoral impact. But I think what I noticed was that actually the electoral impacts, because I looked at what happened during the mayoral election in areas where there were low traffic neighbours and where they were key election issues, that in fact the kind of electoral Armageddon that some politicians think is going to happen when you do these controversial Marmite things would happen, and it didn't. I was talking yesterday to the leader of Hounslow Council and the cycle track that comes through Chiswick, and he was telling me, which I also noted, that the Labour vote went up in those wards around that controversial cycle track. So it's a tough one, because people will be very vocal and make it plain to politicians. And there was a lot of plain speaking, a lot of it directed personally at me.
Yeah, I was thinking about the hot-cold empathy gap, where they kind of underestimate, perhaps they don't fully grasp how much their behaviour and preferences are being driven by their current state. So I'm thinking about COVID and obviously anxiety and fear and possible instabilities for work and so on that were all created at that time. Do you think the responses incurred were heightened because of that hot-cold empathy gap, that the response you got as a politician, and maybe you want to say a little bit more about that, was kind of more profound and extreme than it would have been otherwise?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about that. There's another. I've kind of described it as being driven. This kind of really quite strong and emotional and in places very aggressive reaction was driven by three things, and the reaction was in instances very aggressive. I had death threats. Some of my other council colleagues in LTN areas who were supportive had death threats. Social media became even more toxic than it already was. But those three things were, I think, the kind of discourse in the public square, particularly social media post-Trump, post-EU referendum, became much more toxic, and it was like people had permission to be nasty and unpleasant, and so there was that element to it. You also, I think, as I've already said, had that issue of whenever you challenge people's right to park or drive wherever they will, this kind of car age element to it as well. People get very emotive when they're talking about their cars and their right to drive where and when they want and park wherever they want. And then on top of it, the third thing was the kind of cabin fever that had been produced by the lockdown. So you had this cocktail of all of these things swirling around low traffic neighbours. Now, to me, it seemed a logical thing for us to be doing. Clearly, people were going to feel fearful to go on public transport, and and they wouldn't be able to social distance, and they might catch and spread COVID, and therefore, putting in active travel measures post-COVID and stopping a car-led recovery seemed to me the most sensible and logical thing to do. But logic kind of went out the window, and we had big public marches and rallies, and there were placards with me depicted as a North Korean dictator, and all sorts of personal attacks. Bell, end this hell, with the bell and the end kind of put together on the placard, and to form another well-known phrase. So it got it got really, really personal and really, really nasty at some point.
Yeah. I mean, it's just going back to some of the arguments that were more one in particular, I guess, and from one person in particular. Ella Adu-Kissi-Debra's mother has been quite concerned about low traffic neighbourhoods in the sense of the displacement of traffic, along the lines of saying, in terms of the South Circular in London, that this is what she said, that when her daughter was alive, the congestion on the South Circular was bad, but since the introduction of LTN schemes around the route, it's become far worse. The congestion is terrible. This government simply doesn't care. So that concern about traffic displacement's been quite a big thing. I'd like to go back to that Lyndon Johnson quote, the ability to count. How much evidence is there to say that this actually isn't the case?
As a parent, your heart goes out to anybody in that situation. Certainly, for me, I got involved in tackling air quality because of an incident with my youngest daughter, who once said to me, "Dad, I can't breathe," and I had to take her to A&E, and fortunately she was all right. But it was, these are real things that in that tragic situation, it was life and death, and sadly, she lost her life. So, we've got to be mindful of all of that. Certainly, the data, and you look at what's happened in Waltham Forest, was such that you would see and expect to see initially an increase in traffic on boundary roads, but that over time, as traffic and drivers learn to go in different directions, that the numbers and the increase starts to dissipate, and that you would probably end up with similar amounts of traffic on boundary roads than what you started with. Now, if having looked at the data that we picked up in Ealing, we actually found that the amount of traffic was generally lower. It was occasionally higher, but that was because it was mixed in with all of the ups and downs of we're in lockdown, we're out of lockdown, we're back in lockdown, and so it was difficult to get data that was truly representative of what normal would be. And of course, we now know, what is the new normal. We don't really know what the new normal is. People are still kind of working from home 2 days a week, Mondays and Fridays, and going into the office midweek. So it's I think it's a challenge, but broadly, well, you have to be data driven. You've got to be data driven, and you've also got to give it a chance to work. And yes, that can mean in the short term some increase.
Yeah,
but the long term the long-term benefits are clear from the evidence where people have stuck at it.
Yeah, and other things like concerns about emergency services vehicles, ambulances. I think there was data there that kind of disproved that there were delays with those. But maybe say a little bit about that, and maybe a bit about the inclusive elements. That's been a bit of a challenge in terms of maybe things like disabled access. So these are some of the arguments, I guess, against LTNs that are maybe there as well. I don't know if you want to sort of cover a little bit on that.
Sure. Well, certainly, the debate and the arguments around accessibility for emergency vehicles was kind of one of the main issues that arose from our low traffic neighbours in Ealing, and there were clearly some issues that needed to be ironed out. We had issues with which I had to apologise for, issues in terms of communication, where I'd been told by my officers that we had in fact talked to London Ambulance Service, and in the end it turned out that a wrong email address had been used by officers, and therefore we hadn't. And so that didn't get us off to a good start at all. And I deeply regret that. But we then engaged and listened, and the ambulance service talked about wanting to remove bollards and replace them with ANPR cameras to allow better access for their vehicles, and we did that. We made those changes, and certainly, talking to, and I had lengthy conversations with the borough fire commander. Yeah, he was clear that there was no problems for them to get to where they needed to get to in an emergency situation. But you got situations where fire trucks were not in an emergency situation, or they were wrecking a set of planters and bollards, and then the campaigners against would use that to argue against them, and so it became a really a hot potato and a challenge. But again, reassurances from the London Ambulance Service that it wasn't impacting on their response times. And so again, it wasn't the smoothest of processes, but we did get, I think, to the right place. In terms of disabled people, again, the important thing was that people could always get access to their front doors. There were, low traffic neighbours don't stop anybody getting to their front door. It may take a little longer sometimes, and so again we listened and we gave exemptions to blue badge holders within low traffic neighbourhoods to be able to drive through the ANPR cameras, and we also gave exemptions to minibuses that were driving children and adults with disabilities through low traffic neighbourhoods in order to not impede them. It was also interesting that there was a lot of arguments about whether or not cab firms could get to people's homes and whether they were dropping people off 100 yards away or 200 yards from their homes, or on the opposite side of barriers, which meant to walk at the other end, and this was impacting on people with wheelchairs or disabilities. And again, there were surveys done of local cab firms about whether or not they could get to every address, and whether in fact they provided that service, a door-to-door service with an LTN. And when the survey was done, when the data was there, they did, and it was anything to the contrary was just being whipped up by the opponents.
I think it's time to take a final sort of citywide view, and you also sit as a member on the TfL board, so that kind of city view of, I guess, trying to create cities that support active travel, that is a good thing for people's health, for improving air quality, for reducing congestion, and so on. There's lots of good benefits. It's obviously the story there where we're getting to is one of challenge to some degree. But perhaps we could sort of conclude on the street space programme that happened last year. I think we've talked about the cycle lanes that were implemented, obviously low traffic neighbourhoods, and the funding was a major component of that. The other bit to focus on, just as a final thing, is the school streets. Near to me, the local school where the kids go, they've actually just put one in recently. I have to say it's quite nice. It feels a little bit safer for the kids walking to school, and the air feels probably a little bit cleaner now. So could you just say a few words about what those are and how that's developed? And then I think that would be a good kind of end up on that point.
Yeah, because that's the one area of the street space program and the active travel initiatives that came out of COVID that it seems pretty much everybody supports, and the political pushback as not being anything like low traffic neighbours. So they've been a great success, and essentially the idea is that at dropping off and picking up times at schools, there are barriers, initially temporary barriers, put up about 100 metres either side of the school entrance on the road to stop vehicles coming in to that area immediately around the school gate, and that creates a far calmer and safer atmosphere, and it also encourages children with their families to walk and cycle and scoot to school, and it's, as I say, it's been very successful, and literally hundreds of schools across the city have now got these in place, and what we're doing at the moment is actually making them permanent. So rather than have the temporary barriers, which are quite labour intensive, you have to get parents who volunteer or staff who volunteer from the school to put them out and then take them back in again. Where you do it permanently, you get cameras and you do all of the road traffic consultation that you need to in order to get them permanently in place, and they're working really well, and they've been a great success, and everybody loves them.
So slightly easier to get those in place than the low traffic neighbourhoods, but possibly now, just where's things now with low traffic neighbourhoods? Do you think that the opposition's calmed down a bit, things have settled, and people, because I think there's a bit also about change, that change, as humans, we seem to resist change a little bit, but once it happens, maybe we kind of look back and go, oh, that's kind of worked. I think your story about starting off with your own consultation with your doctor, and then maybe the change that occurred there, that you kind of came to some epiphany or realization, and maybe your doctor did as well, that these things can be good. Do you think that we'll see within the kind of public discourse that people feel the same about low traffic neighbourhoods, that the thing will settle and calm down, and schemes will become embedded in the fabric of the city and taken for granted?
Well, I think that's the hope, and I think we have to kind of learn some lessons from this, and I do think that the introduction of low traffic neighbourhoods in conjunction with the ending of the COVID lockdown made it particularly challenging. We didn't do the levels of consultation that we would have normally done, because essentially the government said, you've got to do this quickly to stop a car-led recovery as we come out of lockdown. And unless you put these low traffic neighbourhoods in by the 30th of September, you don't get the funding. And I'd been frustrated by the fact that for almost the decade of myself being leader, and having had that kind of active travel epiphany, I'd not had any funding at all, barely, crumbs in terms of the amount of funding that was available. And suddenly the government was saying, well, here's some funding to do this. But there was the kind of stick that you've got to put it in. And, not having that consultation, not being able to bring residents along with us, I think was a challenge. So, going forward, one would hope that we can bring residents with us much more and do that pre-consultation in a much better way, or just to do it rather than impose it like the government asked us to do.
Yeah, no, it's a good concluding point. I think the point about engagement with the public is something that CHT has recently, just about to launch a piece of work on active travel implementation, and the public engagement, I think, has come out as quite a strong component that there are lessons to be learned. So we'll be sharing that, and hopefully that will help future schemes be embedded more with greater kind of ease going forward. But thanks so much for your time. That was an interview with Councillor Julian Bell and board member of Transport for London. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you.